How do we cross the line?
Sunday, March the 10th, we are going to throw a big old party, great big party, and we want you all to come. And it's going to be a celebration of participation. Occurred to us that there is a whole lot of stuff going on all across this city and all across the world that you are involved in that most of us don't know about, and we want to celebrate that. We want to pat ourselves on the back. We want to invite others to join us, and we want to celebrate the difference that we are being invited to make in making the city of Austin a better place for everyone, and even taking that hope and those opportunities across our country and even around the world. And so Sunday night, March the 10th, we're going to throw ourselves a big party. There's going to be a lot of food. There's going to be great music. We're going to share some amazing stories of what God is doing. And so between now and then, the Sunday mornings between now and March 10th, I want us to prepare for that celebration. And I want us to prepare by figuring out what is it that keeps us from achieving our destiny. What are the lines that are in our lives that hinder us, that limit us, or that force us into behaviors that don't allow us to really courageously explore the difference we can make in the world that we live in. Because we all have lines. We all have all kinds of lines around us. We have lines that, we stand in, and we stand in line, and we have goal lines and finish lines and side lines. And does anybody have phone lines anymore, or clotheslines? There are lines that other people put on us, that our culture puts on us. They say, here's the lines, and there are lines that we put on ourselves. Our expectations, our hopes, our dreams, our goals. We establish lines and boundaries and limitations. And some of these lines are good, and you should not cross those lines. You should not step out of those lines. You should not get out of line with some things, because when you do, the consequences are horrible. But there are some lines in our life that we need to obliterate, that we need to blur, that we need to step across, because our destiny is on the other side of that line. And so in preparation for our celebration of participation in a month from now, I want us to examine the lines that Jesus crossed. Because he crossed countless lines in his life. And I want to look at a number of lines that Jesus stepped across, and he invites us. He says, come follow me across these lines. Today, I want to begin by looking at the beginning and the end of his life, and the lines that he started with, and the lines that he ended with. But before we talk about that, will you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your word spoken by your servant, anointed by your Spirit, to give us the courage to step across the lines and become the people you have called us to be, to fulfill our destiny, and to make the world around us a better place. Pray that for myself and for my family and for all of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. The first Passover of Jesus' life, or of his public life, Jesus went to the temple in Jerusalem. Now, the temple in Jerusalem in Jesus' day was technically the third temple that had existed in the city. It was the most dominant architectural feature of ancient first century Jerusalem, but this was not the first temple that was constructed there on the threshing floor on a hill in Judea. It was a hill that existed in the time before David, before the first temple. The first temple was built by Solomon about 1,000 years before Christ, and the temple was built on a flat piece of solid rock that for millennium had been used as a threshing floor for sorting out the grain, the wheat, from the chaff. It was on the highest point in the Judean hillside, and it was on that rock that they built this temple. Solomon's temple existed for almost 500 years until Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians invaded Jerusalem and destroyed the entire city, and they leveled the temple. And the temple lay in desolation for almost 70 years until a group of expatriate refugee Jews came back from Babylon and built a tabernacle on that same stone plateau. And they began to offer sacrifices. And shortly after that, a man named Zerubbabel brought an army of Jewish people back from Babylon. And they began to reconstruct what was the second temple, or Zerubbabel's temple. It was a short time after that a man named Nehemiah came and constructed part of the wall, rebuilt part of the wall around the city of Jerusalem. But it was just about 30 years before, or 20 years before the birth of Christ, that King Herod, the Idumean Jewish king, in order to ingratiate himself to the native Judean population, decided that he would purge the national treasury and build a new version of the temple that would be dedicated to himself. It would be King Herod's temple. It was the third temple. The walls of Jerusalem had been expanded, and the temple in Jerusalem dominated the architecture of the city. King Herod's palace was over here on the western side of Jerusalem, and the Romans decided they would build an attachment to this great temple to house their soldiers, sort of as a reminder to the Jewish people that this may be your holy place, but you are still under our thumb. The temple grounds that Jesus walked into on that first Passover were a massive courtyard covered in stones and surrounded by 4 colonnades. These colonnades stretched around the entire Temple Mount, and particularly the one on the eastern side was called Solomon's Colonnade, or Solomon's Porch. And the areas within this cloister, within this portico, were reserved for the teaching of the rabbis. When you read about Jesus teaching in the temple area, he was probably teaching on Solomon's porch, inside of that portico, and there would be classes and lectures and debates, and the theology of the nation was worked out in the conversations of the rabbis on Solomon's porch. But the most elegant part of the court, which was called the Court of the Gentiles, was the royal porch on the southern end. The ancient Jewish historian, Hebrew historian Josephus, records a description of the southern portico, of the royal cloister. He describes it this way: "This cloister deserves to be mentioned better than any other under the sun. This cloister had pillars that stood in 4 rows. The thickness of each pillar was such that 3 men, with their arms extended, would fathom it round." In other words, it was 3 times this size around. The length was a furlong. A furlong is 1/8 of a mile, or about 660 feet. And in this royal portico, there were 162 in 4 rows of these large stone columns. And Josephus tells us that they were 50 feet high. He says, "To such who had not seen it, it was incredible. And to such as had seen it, was greatly amazing." This was the gathering place of central Judea, of Jerusalem. And during the Passover, it would have been filled with tens of thousands of people who had made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the Passover feast and to make offerings on the Day of Atonement. The offerings were made in the formal temple area. There was a balustrade, or a fence, around the outside of the temple, and it had gates that entered into that temple. And next to each gate was a sign that said that if you were not a ceremonially clean Jewish person and you crossed this line, you could be killed. And it said it in Hebrew and it said it in Greek, and these signs warned people, and you had to be authorized, Levitically clean Jewish men and women. And for all the study I've done on the temple, I don't know how they actually checked that out. I mean, was there a card? Was there a stamp you got on your hand? Did they make the guys drop their pants and show them their circumcision? I don't know how that worked. But they could discern somehow if you were a faithful member of the Jewish community, you were allowed out of the court of the Gentiles into the proper temple through this gate. And archaeologists go round and round on whether that was the Nicanor gate or the Shushan gate or the Beautiful gate or the Corinthian gate. But there was a large door there, probably 40 feet high. And you had to be a Jew in good standing to go into what was called the court of the women. This was an area about the size of half of a football field, and on the western edge of it were 12 steps. And every morning and every evening, the Levitical priests would stand at the top of these steps, and they would sing the Psalms. It was their morning worship and their evening worship every day of the year. And the Israelites would gather in here, but only the men could go up the steps into this courtyard, which was the court of the Israelites. But on the other side of a small marker there, inside this temple wall, was the court of the priests. And only the Levitical priests could go into the area where the altar was, where the burnt offerings were made, and the laver. There was a large, beautiful, massive building inside, up a few steps, that was called the Holy Place. And it was here that the sacrificial offerings were offered ceremonially. And one day a year, in the back of this holy place, behind a large woven curtain, was what was called the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies was a place that only the high priest could go into one day a year on the Day of Atonement at the end of the Passover feast. It was during this Passover feast, in the early days of Jesus' first public ministry, that he walked into the court of the Gentiles. In John chapter 2, it tells us that when he walked into the court of the Gentiles, he saw under Solomon's porch not rabbis teaching, not theological debate going on, but the merchandising of worship taking place. For it had been a tradition that was established over 500 years, that when you came to present your offerings in the temple, that each Jewish person was required to first pay a temple tax. Every year, during the Passover, a faithful Jewish man and woman would have to pay a temple tax. The temple tax was equal to 1/2 of one day's wages. In the culture, the Roman culture, that would have been a denarii, and that was one day's wages. So each year you had to pay 1/2 of one day. So what do you make in a day? Cut that in half. That was the tax you had to pay each year in order to come into the temple to worship. But you couldn't pay that tax with your money, your currency from where you lived, even if you lived in Jerusalem. If you were from Syria, or you were from Egypt, or you were from Greece, or you were from Rome, whatever the currency was that you used for the exchange of goods, you would bring that into the temple, and you would go to a table of a money changer. And the money changer would exchange your local currency for temple currency, temple shekels. And of course, that exchange rate was wildly varying depending on which of the money changers you talked to, how wealthy they imagined you to be. And so you would go in and you would have to exchange what might have been 2 or 3 days' wages just to get a temple shekel to pay your half day's wages and taxes, plus exchange fees and other service fees that they would tack on. But another thing that was happening here under Solomon's porch as Jesus entered in on that first Passover of his public ministry was people were brokering animals for the offering on the Day of Atonement. Now, if you were fortunate enough that you could come to the temple with your own lamb or with your own sheep or with a bull or with an offering depended on your stature in life, on your situation. If you were wealthy, you brought an exorbitant offering, a cattle or a sheep or a goat. But if you were poor, you bought a dove, or you brought a dove, or even the poorest of people could make a grain offering. But you couldn't just offer your sheep or your goat or your animal in the temple. They had to be approved by the temple inspectors. So you had to bring your sheep or your goat in, and then it had to be examined. And you had to pay a fee for that examination. And if the tradition is correct, most people's animals were not up to snuff. So you had one of two choices. You had to buy an animal from the brokers who provided animals suitable for sacrifice, or you had to bribe the inspector so that you could pass that inspection. If you had to buy an animal because you didn't bring one or because yours didn't pass inspection, you had to buy an animal at highly inflated rates, much like buying a beer at a football game. $18 for a beer? It cost me $1.50 outside it. Well, that's what the animal prices were, and they were inflated and they were exaggerated, and there were fees tacked on, and you had to pay for all of this in temple currency. So you had to go back to the money changers and exchange some currency, not just to pay the temple tax, but in order to barter with the brokers of the animals for sacrifice. So you can imagine when Jesus walked into the court of the Gentiles, and there's tens of thousands of people waiting online or haggling with these money changers and the sounds of the animals and people bartering back and forth. I thought last year it was only 2 denarii to get my temple tax paid. Well, that's not how it works anymore. All right, now, there's inflation and there's costs. If you think you can get a better deal, go talk to Moshe. I don't know. But Moshe won't give you a better deal, trust me. Moshe is a mensch. And you can imagine the conversations and the arguments and the negotiations that were going on among tens of thousands of people bartering for the economics of worship. And Jesus walks into this. And he says, enough. That is enough. It tells us that he then made a whip out of some rope that he found. And he began to turn over the tables of the money changers, and he snapped the whip at the brokers of the animals, and began to drive them out of Solomon's porch into the court of the Gentiles, all the while saying, my Father's house is supposed to be a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a marketplace. Exactly 3 years after that first visit to the temple during the Passover feast, Jesus went back to the temple. This was in the last week of his life, the last Passover celebration. He had come into Jerusalem triumphantly on Palm Sunday. A few days later, he made his way back to the temple, and the same thing was going on that had been going on 3 years ago. And he repeats the behavior exactly again. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all record for us Jesus' second visit to the temple. And it says that he does exactly the same thing. He fashions from a rope a whip, and he begins to turn over the table of the money changers, and he begins to drive out the brokers of the animals and their animals, and he makes a scene all the while, saying, you have made my Father's house, which is supposed to be a house of prayer, into a den of thieves. Now, higher critical scholars, people who want to sort of find the original meaning of the Bible, and they disregard that the Bible is what it says it is, and they're trying to reconstruct it, say, well, there weren't 2 occasions. That John is recording the same occasion as Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, we're not sure whether it happened at the beginning of Jesus' ministry or at the end, but there's no way that he would have gone back and done the same thing over again. To which I say, why not? Why wouldn't he? It's a perfect bookend to his life. His public life began by going into the temple and saying, hey, this is wrong. And in the final days of his life, when nothing has changed, he goes in and he says, hey, this is wrong. And I believe that there were 2 occasions that he went in the first weeks of his life, of his public life, and he went in the last week of his public life, because he had 2 lines that he needed to cross. The first line, when he went in John chapter 2, at the beginning of his public life, he was crossing the line of our expectations. See, if you're going to make a difference in the world, you have to understand the difference between your expectations and reality. Because we all put up lines about our expectations, and we put our lines up about the expectations of how our life is supposed to be, how the world is supposed to be around us. And we have to come to terms with our expectations, whether they're realistic or unrealistic. And the first line we have to cross, if we are going to make a difference in the world that we live in, is we have to understand which of our expectations we need to follow and which we need to step across. And Jesus says the expectations you have of God need to be changed. See, he walked into the temple that day, and as he was turning over the tables, and as he was driving out the brokers of the animals, he was quoting the passion of the scripture for the house of God. And in John chapter 2, John makes a note that he and the other disciples realized what Jesus was doing. He was fulfilling a prophecy. Now, the interesting thing is the prophecy that John is referring to is not a prophecy at all. It isn't written by one of the great prophets like Ezekiel or Jeremiah or Isaiah. It's from the book of Psalms. Now, my theory is that at some point in the first days of Jesus gathering his disciples, he said, "Hey, fellas, I want you to know who I really am. I want you to begin to understand who I am. And if you want to know who I am, I want you to read the 69th Psalm. Because the 69th Psalm is not just a lament psalm that David wrote when he was feeling down. It is a prediction about me. The 69th Psalm is about me. It's talking about me as the Messiah. David was predicting this is the heart of the deliverer of Israel. Psalm 69 that Jesus, or that the disciples were referring to as Jesus was clearing the temple the first time, says this: Lord, the Lord Almighty, may those who hope in you not be disgraced because of me. God of Israel, this is the mind of Christ. May those who seek you not be put to shame because of me, for I endure scorn for your sake, and shame covers my face. I am a foreigner to my own family, a stranger to my own mother's children. He was not the Messiah they were looking for. He was the condemned one. He was the scorned one. He was the disgraced one. And he said the characteristic of that disgraced, scorned, and rejected Messiah is his zeal for the house, for the temple, that consumes him. And the insults of those who insult you fall on me. See, Jesus knew what they were looking for. They were looking for a triumphant Messiah. They were looking for a Messiah who was going to come in and vanquish all their enemies. They were looking for a Messiah that when he showed up, it was game over. All of the evil would be put aside and all of the good would triumph. Bad guys would lose, good guys would win. Messiah, yay, hooray. They weren't looking for a suffering, humble Messiah. They weren't looking for a servant deliverer. They weren't looking for God to express his love to his people by sacrificing himself. They weren't looking for the love of God to be expressed in such a graphic terms that this is how much I love you, that I would die for you. They weren't looking for a Messiah who's going to say, I will triumph over the ultimate enemy, and it's not the Romans, it's death. And the only way I can triumph over death is to be put to death so that I can rise again. He didn't fit the paradigm. They had a very clear line drawing of who the Messiah is supposed to be. And we have the same one. Our expectations of God are made in our own image. That God is supposed to color within the lines of our expectations. Our lives are supposed to be these favorable, successful, pain-free existences. Without difficulty, without the brutality of the world encroaching itself on us. And when life invades our expectations, we say, God failed. Because God didn't meet my expectations. Because God did not live up to what I believe God was supposed to be. And if we want to be the people that God is calling us to be, we have to step across that line of our expectations and say, I will trust you even if I can't understand you. I will trust you even when I don't see you. Because you are a God who colors outside of the lines. You are a God who refuses to be put into the box of our expectations. And I believe if we are going to be the people of faith we are called to be, we have to step across the line of our expectations of God. Just like Jesus did. He said, I am not the God you expected me to be. 3 years later, when he returned to the temple for the second time in the last week of his public ministry, he stepped across a second line. The first line he stepped across was the line of our expectations. The second line he stepped across was the line of our exclusions, of our exclusivity. That line that says it has to be according to my way. Our exclusivity. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record the same event. They record Jesus going in and reciting for them the prophecy of Ezekiel, or Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 11. In Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 11, he's condemning the Israelites for turning the house of God into a den of thieves. And they all record that. But Mark records something just a little different. 3 different words. It says that when Jesus says, my house shall be a house of prayer, Mark says he's referring to Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 56. And what he's saying in Isaiah chapter 56 is that my house shall be a house of prayer, and it's 3 more words, for all nations. I think Mark is connecting the dots for us and saying what Jesus was referring to was the prophecy of Isaiah. Because Isaiah 56 was talking about the heart of God for people to come and worship him freely. In Isaiah chapter 56, the prophet said this, and this is what Jesus was referring to on that second time when he entered into the temple, and he said, my house shall be a house of prayer for all nations. Isaiah chapter 56, he says, foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord, foreigners, not Jews, to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants, these foreigners I will bring to my holy mountain, and I will give them joy in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. If you were a foreigner, you couldn't even get over this fence without being killed. If you were an unclean Jew, you couldn't make your way into the court of the Israelites. Unless you were a priest, you couldn't make your way into the court of the Levites. And if you were not the high priest, you couldn't enter into the presence of God in the Holy of Holies. And Isaiah was saying the heart of God is for anyone who is seeking me to find me. And that's why he says, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. The sovereign Lord declares, he who gathers the exiles of Israel, I will gather still others to them besides those already gathered. You know who those others are? They're us. It's us. What Jesus was doing when he was walking into the temple on the last days of his life, he was obviously disturbed by the commercialization of worship, by the monetization of faith, and by the greed that was being exhibited in the place where the law was to be taught and faith was to be expanded. He was grieved by that. But the line he was stepping across was the line of the hindrance that comes because of the exclusivity that our religion creates. You ever seen that? Been in a church much? It's what we do. It's what we do. We create a currency. We create a currency in our behaviors. We create a currency in our beliefs. We create a currency in our language, in the songs that we sing, and the things that we say to one another. And it's an insider currency. It's a temple currency. And if you want to be with us, you have to go through the process of exchanging You can't be a person who has a sketchy belief system or perhaps an outrageous morality, or who has damage or problems that are unlike us. And if you want to get to the God that we know, you have to go through all the filters and all of the exchanges, and we become the money changers. It becomes up to us to determine whether or not you're correct enough in your belief, whether or not you're pure enough in your behavior, whether or not you can have access to the God that we know. And Jesus obliterates that line. He says, no way is that what God intended. The thing that I believe that he is most tearing apart when he comes into the temple is not the monetization of religion. It is the restrictions and the hindrances, the complexity and the difficulty that we put on people's access to the love of God and the heart of God by keeping it to ourselves, by cloistering it in buildings, by coding it in dogma and doctrine and the right beliefs and things. And he says, no, you got to step across that line, because on the other side of that line is where you take me to them where they are. Because that's my heart. See, Jesus was reinventing the whole temple. He's reinventing the whole thing. That first time that he walked into the temple on Passover, the first public ministry, after he was turning over the tables and he was driving out the money changers and the brokers of the offering animals, it got the attention of the temple guards and the priests. Of course it would. It was putting hundreds of thousands of dollars at risk. And so I imagine eventually over here somewhere near Solomon's porch, they surrounded him, the temple guard and a number of the reigning priests, and they said, what are you doing? You can't come in here and create this. By what authority do you come in here? We demand proof. We demand a sign of your authority to come in here and mess with all of this commerce. And he said, you want a sign? I'll give you a sign. I'm going to burn this place to the ground. I'm going to tear this temple down. And in 3 days, I'm going to build it right back up. And their minds exploded, and they said, how can you do that? We've been working on this temple for 46 years, and it's not even done yet. And you said you're going to build it in 3 days? And then John notes, after the resurrection, after the second time he went into the temple and turned over the tables, after the crucifixion, after he was raised from the dead, the disciples got it. He wasn't talking about this temple at all. He was talking about his body as the temple. You see, what he was doing was he was saying, I will make myself accessible to anyone, anywhere, without restrictions. You don't have to come to Jerusalem. You don't have to pay the temple tax. You don't have to spend your finances to gain access to me. You don't have to go through the rituals. It won't happen one day a year, because my body will be the temple. And you know who his body is? It's us. The Spirit of God lives in us, individually and in community. And he was stepping across this line. He was obliterating this line that says, this is not an exclusive club. This is supposed to be easy for people to find. How difficult do we make it? Well, you have to show up here. You have to believe what we believe. You have to stop doing that stuff that you do that just really bothers us. You have to change. And then maybe you can know the God that we know. Jesus blew that line out of the water and said, no. You want to make a difference in the world that you live in? You have to be the temple. You have to bring the temple with you. You see, Jesus never went in the temple proper. He never went in there. As far as we know, he never went inside. And he could have walked right through the whole place. Said, hey, this is my house. But he came into the court of the people, the court of the Gentiles. And he said, I'm reinventing this whole thing. I'm rebuilding what this is. I'm taking down all of the barriers and all the restrictions and all the hindrances. Never went across the lines. He just obliterated the only ones that mattered. He obliterated the line of our expectations, and he obliterated the line of our exclusivity and our exclusions. And this is what we have to do. If we're going to make a difference in the world that we live in, this is what we have to do. We have to push back on the boundaries between the haves and the have-nots, between the ins and the outs, between those who believe and those who don't. We have to push those lines back. We have to step across those lines of our expectations and our comforts, our limitations and our fears. We've got to man up. We've got to be courageous, and we've got to say, okay, we're going to take the risk of being uncomfortable. We're going to color outside of the lines. We're going to live in the mess. I'm convinced that if we are going to make a difference in the world that we live in, if we are going to make the city of Austin a better place for all people, if we are going to accept God's invitation to participate with him in the transformation of the hope of the hopeless, we have to step across those lines. And that's what we're going to celebrate a month from now. Sunday night, March the 10th, we're going to come together and we're going to celebrate the line crossing. The people who have accepted that invitation to participate in the changing of the world that we live in and to making the lives of the world around us a better place. We're going to celebrate those stories. And I hope to see you there.